Hello and welcome to Fintech Impact. I'm your host, Jason Pereira. Today on the show, we have Art Harrison, co-founder and chief growth officer of Daylight Automation. Daylight Automation is a company that, surprise, surprise, helps companies automate their data processes and create greater efficiencies around things like onboarding, document population, and you name it. And with that, here's my interview with Art. Art, thanks for taking the time.
Awesome. Appreciate you having me here today.
My pleasure. So Art Harrison of Daylight Automation, tell us about Daylight.
Sure. At our core, our mission is to enable companies to improve any interaction between people and process. And usually the best way that I can describe what we do and how we enable these companies is to give an analogy. If you're in Canada, the US, you always have to interact with taxes. That's a business process that the IRS or the CRA owns. We can't change it. We might want to, we might not like it. We can't change it. The advisors may be helping you. You may be using something out of that $10 billion tax industry that is TurboTax. And that's because while it's a great process for the tax agencies and their auditors, it's a terrible thing to interact with as a person, especially when it's something as stressful as finances. So, up and
they don't enable things like APIs or any kind of modern architecture.
Exactly.
Little conversation with CRA, but why would you need that? Like, oh my God, are you kidding me?
That's crazy. No, absolutely. And it's why there's a $10 billion industry on the tax software. There's why there's advisors and people to help you is because they've built a better on-ramp to a business process that they couldn't even control. So, you just take TurboTax as an example. It's a solution that's going to guide you through the right questions. Make sure that you contextually are providing the right information. Did you change a job? Did you get married this year? Do you have kids? It's going to ask you the right questions. It's going to make sure that you have answered correctly, validating what you've inputted first. And when you're done, it's going to deliver that information in the way that the tax agencies need it, whether that's, a dozen paper forms and addendums or an e-submission. It's going to deliver it back to the organization in the way they need it, but it didn't force the user to experience it that way. And Daylight is a platform that enables organizations to create that kind of an experience for any interaction point between a people or a process. So that could be at the self-service channel. It could be an assisted channel where someone like an advisor is guiding someone through on behalf of some other process, or it may even be internal, dealing with HR issues or audits or security, anything else. Any interaction point, Daylight is a platform that lets organizations build what they want for their user experience.
So, at the end of the day, you are for lack of a better term, workflow engine that basically also ensures that provides the tools for being able to put that workflow together to the end user and all the intelligence that goes into it and all the execution and deliverables that go into it.
Yeah. Sometimes I just say it's simplest way. You can build that choose your own adventure so that you can memorialize and standardize a process that you can build it into an experience for yourself, for your employees, or for your customers to take the guesswork out of it. And that's really, how you can create delightful experiences out of things that traditionally were really scary and really difficult to interact with.
Yeah, it's not just that. I'd have to say also that. Of course. But here's the issue, right? It's when you really think about everything there's always a process to something a business does.
Yeah.
The question is, how standardized, codified is it? A lot of times these processes get figured out by people who need to get from point A to point B, never written down and never kind of optimized, right?
Yeah.
Never standardized. And people, with more experience in it can get things done faster than others. So there's no institutional kind of repository of that. And when you think about that, how broken a system that is. Can you imagine a car assembly line being run that way?
Just like smoke signals and like legends passed down of like, here's how we kind of build the cars. Yeah.
That's it, right? But that's how the vast majority of businesses processes work. And I get it because, hey, in a busy business, you're moving so fast. You don't necessarily have time to think or map these out, but then you pay the price long run. So yeah, it's a challenge.
And you're hitting it on the head. And that is often as a business, we talk about those outcomes, building this amazing experience, delighting your customers, your employees. There's a flip side of that equation, which is making that change is so difficult. It's one thing to, you have an IT group or you have a desire, you have someone with an idea of how they want to improve it. But depending on the size of the organization, making that change is so hard. That's why I use the tax example in the fact that, most organizations, they start and they redo the entire end-to-end process. But the tax software is a good example of saying, well, where's the problem? The problem isn't necessarily the end where the auditors are, where the CRA is. The problem is how the individual is interacting with it. And so that's a big part of it is how do you enable the people that actually know how to do this? When you're going to codify it, you don't want just an IT group or one person in a silo to go and say, hey, here's how we think it's done. You need to empower the people that are actually doing it, the advisors, the frontline staff, the people that have done it, that know all the ins and outs. If you can empower them to be able to codify what they know into an experience to simplify it and standardize for every future employee on that assembly line, or to actually push it out to the client to do themselves, then you're really getting somewhere. And that's been a challenge is how do organizations actually go about making change and doing it across the literally thousands of processes that they have that are ripe for improvement?
Yeah, so we're going to come back to that because we kind of skipped over my second question. And that question is quite honestly, it's very simple. Tell us about the origin. What was the genesis of Daylight Automation, and how did it come to be?
Yeah, sure. It's an interesting story. My co-founder, Ryan Kimber, who's our CEO, it's one of those stories that come out of not a happy place in life, but sometimes that's where the best ideas come from. And it was actually, he went through the sudden loss of his mother-in-law, and that's a really trying experience. Death, taxes, finances, all these are really problematic experiences. And he was actually in the funeral home, and they offered a service, which is, if you've ever dealt with a sudden death, so much paperwork and so much process follows you around for years to come. So they offered a process where they said, hey, for a fee, we'll interview you about your loved one. We'll find out, hey, did they go to university? Were they an alumni member? Did they get the alumni magazine? Where did they shop?
Did this guy pass away in Ontario? Because I think I know this service.
I believe she did pass away in Ontario.
There you go. I know exactly what you're talking about. But yes.
Yeah. Do they collect frequent flyer miles? Where do they shop? So they'll go through an interview process with you to learn about you. And when they're done, they actually mailed a binder with every document that you need to transfer the points or cancel the magazine subscription, with little stickets of where to sign and pre-stamped envelopes so you could actually mail it all in. And it was at that moment, his wife could see it in his eyes and kind of said, you just had a business idea, didn't you? And, he had worked, as have I, in organizations on transformation around document management. And he realized, this is an amazing way to simplify this process. And it's not just one process. It's a multiple things all done at the same time. And if you could bring that same ability to do that in financial services and insurance and the government, that there was something really meaningful to be had there. So that's where the origin came out of. And over time, he brought it to me a little convincing. I thought he was just looking for some free help, and I was working on a startup of my own at the time. But it was my wife, both of our wives are clearly the wise ones, who was like, no, the first time you told me about this is going to change lives. This is going to change the lives of the people who interact with it. It's going to change our lives. So you have to do this. And she's the more conservative one in the family. So I listen when she's telling me to go after something a little more adventurous.
Excellent. So, let's go back to the core we were discussing before in terms of business processes. And that actual example, which I'm very familiar with that company, is a wonderful example. This is, it started from someone who went through the process himself and said, I can't believe that there's not a guide for this. And over time, they figured out every possible question you could ever think to answer, asking things that would never occur to most people. So they are incredibly thorough, and they've even built software around how to populate all that. And by the time you're done the conversation, the button gets hit and all gets sent. So great, wonderful service I refer to all the time. But that's an organization that I think, because of the complexity, realized that the only way they were going to make this thing work was to truly map out everything. And when you think about the problems that so many businesses encounter, and I think we're seeing it a lot in the financial industry right now because of new regulation. And I see companies complain, oh no, it's moving too fast, we can't implement. And I'm sitting here going but if you actually had proper data stewardship and the systems for just for proper digital onboarding and modifying just the inputs, you could have solved this in weeks. You could have solved this in weeks. And so much, I feel like hopefully this latest round of regulation shakes these companies up to say, we cannot put ourselves in this position again. So, talk to me about, and I'm just thinking that's kind of, so talk to me about what you're seeing in terms of appetite in the market. Has what I'm saying here actually resonated with any of them and actually said, okay, this is what we should have had 2 years ago so that we wouldn't be where we are today? Or what are you hearing?
We are hearing it. Obviously, there's a kind of a collision of interest, whether it's the regulations. COVID had a massive impact on the appetite for change and the realization that people needed to change, because things that were traditionally, we talked about that tribal knowledge of how to do a process. I'm going to use banks as an example. Complicated process. Someone would just walk across the next office and say, hey, I have a client that's looking to do this. How do I do it? And that all went away in an instant. People were at home. You couldn't rely on that shared knowledge. So the appetite is changing. It used to be that you'd find a few champions and they would fight their way through the organizations. But you are seeing more and more from the, not just, the mid-tier, or the people that are trying to make change. You're seeing it from the executives, you're seeing it from the ground up. The challenge is still, they don't know how to do it. Historically, when they were faced with something like this, and you were kind of touching on this, the data stewardship, they do still tend to blow it out. And, someone will come in and say, well, let's rewrite everything. It's the equivalent of the old dev model of like, oh, I don't like the way this is working, so let me just rebuild the entire application. And if you've ever worked as a developer,
that won't take time.
Yeah. And of course you're going to, what they don't understand is the like million of edge cases that you have no idea are actually happening behind the scenes. So they're still struggling with that model of, I always refer to it as inside out. And they start from the inside and they say, well, let's build the data model or the data lake. And we're going to build this new suite of tools that will onboard everything to, and then we'll finally have clean data. And we're seeing that's still a struggle. The ones that do it right are starting from the outside in and saying, okay, it's no different than what we just talked about in that funeral experience, is that they started from, hey, how do we collect the right information? How do we make the process better? Once you've done that, once you've improved how you're actually collecting the data, you can, I'm not saying wait forever, but you can delay and you can think about how you're going to ultimately store that data. But the first step is, and this is where daylight automation comes in, we really focus on breaking apart a traditional term that organizations use, which is digitization and automation. And I like to talk about digitization, then automation. If you're always looking at that automation first, you're often not actually solving the root of the problem. How am I interacting? Where is my data coming in? Is it good data? Is it clean data? Is it accurate data? And so when they start from that area, whether it's in a funeral home, whether it's at a major financial institution, whether it's an advisor, you can build the knowledge, build the data capture right first. And even if you have to interact with old legacy processes for 6 months, you're still building the right foundation. When you're ready, as you keep evolving, you can build a better automation suite and end-to-end straight through digital processing environment. But now you're doing it off of your ideal experience, your clean data. But so I think it is changing. It's not just changing the experience that they want. It's how they work. It's how they think. That's the challenge that most organizations face when facing the incoming digital first entities, whether that's in, insurance, in wealth, anywhere, is they've been doing it one way for a long time. It's still difficult to make that kind of a change.
Yeah, and I get that. It would be nice if the entire foundation was immaculately perfect, but the reality is I think the viewpoint you have there is almost to some degree the old saying about no plan survives first encounter with the enemy. You can sit back in the ivory tower and plan out for every scenario you think you're going to happen, but at the end of the day, the second you unleash it to the public, they're going to throw things at it you never dreamed of. So in so many ways, tackling one thing, putting it out there, and then learning from that experience is so much more valuable.
That's the whole agile methodology, right? Like you don't know what you don't know till you've tried it. I'm gonna, just for fun, there's a story I like to tell all the time, and it's not exactly that. It's the other symptom that I see in organizations is striving for that perfection first, or misunderstanding what going digital means. So there was a use case we had. It was it was an account administrative type activity, granting power of attorney. I'm sure you've dealt with it many times yourself. Wanting to give someone access over their funds or accounts. As soon as we were working with an organization who wanted to build it digital, they had everyone, and their brother in the room, and the scope just got so massive. They're like, well, we need to account for the possibility that someone brings in an infinite number of people to give power of attorney over. And, and I don't even understand that.
Infinite. Here's the infinite. Thing. It's funny because I often rail against the stupidity I've seen some of these systems where it's like, oh, you thought that one person wouldn't own more than one of an account type, as if there was no other reason to do that. That's nonsense. Now, don't get me wrong. That's nonsense. Infinite is also nonsense. Let's get realistic.
And that was what we had to have a conversation, which is like, first of all, what's the standard? The standard is one person.
Plus a backup, if that.
And a backup, yeah, right?
Or three working in conjunction with each other.
And I think that was it. Like when you get to three, that accounted for something like 98.9% of all use cases. And that,
right. And I'm sure if you got to 9, you get to 100% and then some, but sure.
And then some. And that's it. And you have to explain to people that well, what about covering that? Even the 95% use case, there's always exceptions. Even when you're building the ideal customer experience, if someone does need to bring in 20 people, well, that's the one. Is it worth $1 million of building technology to support that? Or is that something where you say, great, come on in and let's deal with that manually, right? But there's this, people, when you get into the room in technology, there's some pragmatism gets lost with some people. And there's like, well, it's digital. I can do whatever I want magically. And so the larger the organization, the more that scope creep tends to come in.
Old snowball, right? Like suddenly everybody wants their favorite color sprinkle to be an option when in the end of the day, you don't even have the cookie baking yet.
Exactly.
No, I see that. It's, yeah, I think so often, especially when I sit on some of these advisory boards or even when I'm advising, fintechs, I'm just like, look, stop running away. Like I refer to my job as professional squirrel killer, because people will will chase squirrels left, right, and center. And I'm sitting back like every time it's like, let's define scope, minimum viable product scope. What are we doing now? You want to create a project to make it better after it's running? Great. But here is the very narrow goalpost we have to shoot between first, right? And then go. And yeah, I get it. Everybody wants to tinker and wants to have their little say in the thing that they basically we're responsible for.
Well, and that's where, where we get excited as Daylight is what I have found is when you empower the people that are the front line or a step behind the front line who are living the pain of the process, they actually tend to be more pragmatic. They just want to simplify what they're doing. They don't want to have 10 screens open and take away an hour of time that they would normally spend actually building a relationship with a client. They don't want to spend that doing manual work. So they're really incentivized. They're really motivated to solve the problem. And they get the idea that no, I'm fine to do this one or two little edge case. I just want to solve the majority of things that I know could be better. So Daylight, where we're really focused on is, how do we satisfy the needs of an IT group, but also empower that citizen developer as a kind of, modern term for it. How do we empower them to be able to solve their own problems? And they actually know it better. The other story that kind of is at the core of who Daylight is that when you make it so that those people can contribute to the product and the project, you actually get the real result that you need. Going back to that infinite use case, the other thing that happens all the time when you come out of IT is if IT builds it, they think they understand how it works. And then you talk to someone on the front line, you're like, yeah, that's what they tell us, but here's what I really do. This is what I actually do because you can't do this or it doesn't make sense for my clients.
General
and so if
versus
you can,
private. That's
yeah,
the problem, right? The generals think they know what's going on in the battlefield. The guys in the trenches, they're like, yeah, buddy, that's not how it works.
That's not how it works. That sounds great on a little board moving pieces around. Exactly. And so we really focus on how do we make their on-ramp to map their business process, see it, iterate on it, give feedback to it. How do we make sure that they're included while also satisfying all the data needs and the security and compliance and regulatory needs that technology and especially in the fintech space have to account for. Otherwise, we're just not going to be a viable solution to any mid to large size organization.
Absolutely not. So, okay. So talk to me about what kind of mindset change that is, because a lot of this stuff does get built in the ivory tower, for lack of a better term. And a lot of the people, and I think that's part of the challenges too, is the people on the front lines don't know how to speak the language of the people who are building this stuff. I often make the joke about that one character in Office Space where he's like, my job is to tell the engineers what to build. And they're like, can't the clients do that? And they're like, no. And everybody thinks it's a joke, but the reality is translating effectively between the real world deliverable that is subject matter dependent into tech parlance as to this is what needs to be delivered, and here are the vital points and why. That is a skill set that not many people contain. So talk to me about there's got to be conflict there or lack of understanding when you try to change this cultural aspect of the ivory tower versus the trenches. What have you done or what have you seen to enable that entire kind of bridging of that?
There's a few different things. So number one, the mindset is changing across organizations that we're dealing with, but it's not necessarily changing because of some altruistic ideal. What was happening historically was there was a few projects that had the budget, that had the desire, the executive kind of line of sight to them that were getting done, and they would figure out that translation piece. All the other projects, just because it wasn't happening at that meeting of minds between the IT folks and the lines of business folks, didn't mean it wasn't happening. What was happening was all these areas were going out and buying new technology, doing it themselves and doing it in some way, working around the system to still solve their own problems. We're all looking to make our lives easier. So people were still finding ways to do it. And ultimately the burden was then coming back onto that IT group to maintain it, because someone did go find a new solution, they implemented it, and then they left. And now everyone still goes to IT. It's not working. I'm going to pick up the phone. I'm going to call my IT person. I'm going to call my technology people and be like, how do I use this? And they didn't even know it existed. Yeah,
this
exactly.
credit card is this being paid for on?
Exactly. Yeah. So that was a challenge. And as a result, organizations are making that shift and saying, we need something we can govern, and we need something that we understand how it works, that we can give to our lines of business and let them solve, whether they have some technical resources, whether it's the frontline people doing it. So we are seeing that shift. In terms of Daylight, what we've done is we focused on the guardrails that are needed to bring the most value without letting even those frontline people overstep their bounds. So you've probably had people on your podcast. There's a whole class of low code application design, application suites out there. And there's some areas where they serve great purpose. But where IT hates them is when people are actually starting to create their own data model and storing data in silos within their organizations. So Daylight really thought about the problem and said, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And we go back to that tax example where it's, how do I build the right on-ramp for any business process, even when I can't control what it needs to look like downstream? And by doing that, we've put the guardrails in that said, we're not going to store your data, which is our default stance. We can store data, but by default, it's returned back to an organization in whatever form they need it, whether that's a collection of paper documents, an API call, a file upload. And the guardrails for the subject matter expert are, you're designing, just like you would in a Visio diagram or a process map, you're designing the rules of your process. If this is a corporation, here's what I need to follow up with. If their beneficiary is under 17, I need to add a trustee. They're mapping out the rules of the data that they need to collect in the experience. And then they're mapping it to whatever is available. Is it a paper form? Is there an API call that IT has enabled that I just say, here's how I collected it, and now I'm going to pass it to that API? So we gave them the ability to participate without overstepping their bounds. And then we gave IT and those other groups the ability to govern the release cycle, the data flow in and out of the application, where the data is going to be stored. So we've kind of found this happy medium where IT, who is skeptical about some end user focused solution, actually sees, hey, all that I'm doing is I'm offloading my need to sit in those requirement meetings and the constant need to iterate when it is out in the market. But I'm still controlling the pieces that are essential to my vision, which is the data stewardship, this ideal end state where I can actually see and run analytics and do all the other things through APIs. So for us, it was that separation of the experience from the data and really focusing on the different audiences that will participate in making the ideal experience for any process.
And I mean, it's a growing trend, I'd say, to start to try to empower people further downstream, right? I think at the end of the day, they know their problem better than the IT people do, and there's more of them. What you built also, correct me if I'm wrong, is a pretty low to no code platform right now, correct?
Yeah, at the level where you're designing your process. So that's kind of the way of lowering the bar of who's able to participate.
Exactly. So, I mean, this is, and for those unfamiliar with it, please take a look at the concept of no code or low code. Frankly, some of the tools out there are just boggle the mind at how good they are at this point and how good they're becoming. And frankly, unless they become good or easier to use faster, we're never going to solve the shortage of developers that we have out there.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
The thing that you get to the point where someone can take a tech savvy non-coder can basically take a couple of video classes and start solutioning their own problem without creating a separate data silo or duplicating data within the system. Being able to go in and say, okay, they need a name field, name, they need a SIN number field, and some sort of intelligence to check that, oh no, that data already exists, let's pull it in here. And now we can action in this way. And anything that's new gets added to that same data model. Like the ability for that kind of bidirectional kind of empowerment is revolutionary in terms of how much faster things can move. Because now your entire dev team is not your dev team. It's your dev team and a cohort of your end users who want to solve their own problem.
Yeah, no, that's it. And as I said, like I'm a realist person along the way. And I think Daylight kind of mirrors Ryan and my's approach to like, how do we bring value today without burdening you with problems in the future? And I would say, I hear this more at the large enterprise side, but without guardrails, there is the fear. There's a fear that just like they used to buy technology that I don't even know what you're using and whose credit card is on it. There's a fear that if it's not implemented right, or if you're using a different low code solution for every problem you have, or people are still building out new data models in it, that they're going to face a nightmare 3 years down the road when they wake up and realize there's 1,000 applications running on 1,000 different computers. So we recognize that. And that's where, again, I'm not saying that there's one perfect solution, but Daylight really is focused on providing low code in terms of the process build, the experience build, that area that the SME is the expert in, but still empowering the IT folks to focus on what they want to do. They want repeatability. They want to build that single pipe that feeds data in, and single pipe to move that data back into their core systems. And so you can't ignore that. You have to, especially the large enterprise, you do have to focus on the requirements they still have and where the dev team still wants control. Otherwise, you can still get down a path that's not going to be ideal. And I think Daylight has really found a way to bridge those two when needed. Not everyone needs that. Some people just need to build something and there's not a big IT team telling them, hey, don't do it. And that's great too. But I come from the enterprise space and I tend to think of them to make sure that we've got the right controls in place. And then it still is going to service, down market as well for everyone that just wants to rapidly build something out.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because there's a mindset shift there, because it stops becoming about the ones who control and action everything. And that's a relinquishing of control to ones who basically steward the efforts of the entire organization, right?
That's right.
That's a huge cultural shift in terms of mindset, right? Just enormous.
Yeah. And we've been talking about that mindset and shift there. That's that one thing. Nobody wants to give up control either, in that constant battle between IT and business folks. And so if you can find a way where they realize, oh, wait, I just don't have to do the stuff. I've been a developer. There's stuff I don't want to build another email widget. I don't want to build another, I don't want to do this stuff. I want to focus on something that's meaningful. I don't want to go back to
online form, right? For this abstract use case.
Yeah. Like that's not
PDFs. Like, come on.
And now as an operator, I don't want, the same goes for me. I don't want my development team who are helping drive our platform forward. I don't want them working on some little edge case. I want them focused on things that are of most value. That's what we're recruiting all the time for, high-end developers. I don't want them then on low value activities. So it's the same in any organization. You want to keep them on the things that matter, and you want to but you don't want to avoid doing the work that's going to make a change for everyone else.
Well, that's the true impact, is right. You get to stop putting your very expensive full stack devs on, we need a cornflower blue button on this one form.
Exactly.
To basically having, let's be realistic. It's also a cost play, right? Like the reality is, if you can train up someone who knows how to use a computer with a series of instructional videos or like boot camp on this, you're talking about massive savings per hour, and so much more getting done without the eliminate. And this is the thing, is some people may view this as a threat to their jobs in the developer world, but frankly, it's like, come on, like there's not enough work to go around. Like, give me a break. That's
it. But someone on my team recently was telling me, I think I'm probably going to paraphrase it poorly, but it's I think he told me it was a Warren Buffett activity where it's, at the start of the week, you write down the top 20 things you need to work on. And then you go back through the list and you circle the top 3 or the top 5. That's what you want to do. It's the number 6 through 20 that are the ones that are the biggest trap. Anything 21 and beyond is not important to you. 6 through 20 seems important, but so you feel pretty good about doing it, but you're actually not doing the number one thing on your list. And that goes for you want those developers doing the core thing, and everything else is important, but there's other people that can contribute to that getting done.
The old Stephen Covey, like, you got to fill a jar. If it's sand, you have stones, large stones, pebbles, and sand. And you fill the jar with sand first, you'll never fit the other 2 in. But if you fill the rocks first, you'll be able to squeeze in.
You'll be able to,
stuff, right? So absolutely, it's got to be a priority. And those, let's face it, those long tail priorities for people downstream just never come to fruition, quite honestly, or they get rolled into a much larger project down the road. So it's really inefficient when it comes down to it.
Yeah. Just to give you a little scope on what we see, and again, we cross all kinds of things. We've been in pharmacy processes, here in Canada. If you've done some vaccinations, flu or COVID, we've powered omni-channel experiences there. We've done wealth advisors and banks and everyone else. So we kind of cross the gamut, but I use some of the large ones just for illustrative purposes. One of our clients, I believe when we first started talking to them, they had 10,000 processes internally that were either paper or Excel or legacy based. And what they were finding was that, in a given year, only the top 5 might get attention. because the way that they typically had worked, you had to have enough budget. You had to show that, hey, it's going to cost us $5 million to make this improvement. So it better return 10 or 15 to the organization. So all the little interactions, the power of attorney we talked about, changing my RSP from one bank to another, just updating my address or my beneficiaries, all that stuff was there. And there was someone raising their hand saying, this is problematic. They just weren't getting touched. And they would do the top 5. The next year, they'd have a different top 5. And then the third year, the one from year 1 was back on the list again. So they're just like polishing the same stones over and over and over again. And there was literally tens of thousands of processes happening in branches, happening in call centers that just don't get any attention. But the effect of it, I just was on a call, one process at a bank, by digitizing it in that way we talked about in the TurboTax kind of analogy, it was 37,000 hours they saved in terms of administrative work in front of their clients in that year. Now, that's a huge scale because it's a national bank, but you can imagine the cumulative effect of how much time you have your staff, your experts at building relationships, at advising people on the right things to do for their accounts, how they can grow their money, how they can plan for retirement.
Here, man. Like I
know it kills me.
Oftentimes people in back offices who don't get this stuff don't understand why I get so incredibly frustrated. And it's like, it's simple. I'm cursed with knowledge. I'm cursed with the knowledge that it doesn't have to be this way. And
it doesn't.
I am struggling to get you to understand to the level that I understand what's capable of and how transformational this is. And it's unfortunately, it's, most people focus on doing the one thing they're told to do in front of them. They don't necessarily understand that this is what's possible or what's feasible and just the enormous benefits to it. So,
but seeing the light go on, I'll leave it on that, which is that's the most satisfying part about running this organization, being part of this for the last 5 years, is watching that person get empowered and watching them every other week, watching a team roll out, hey, we've improved this. And to the delight of the other employees, to the delight of the customers, everyone is known, we all live in a modern world. We know what's possible. And so the frustration is when you're like, well, how come I can do that when I'm trying to order groceries, but I can't do it at my own job? And so seeing that light go on when teams are empowered is one of the most satisfying things. It's really an amazing thing to happen. I'm excited to see more of it. But it's a great way to spend your
day. My pushback on every time someone tells me like, well, when I'm like, well, why can't I know the status of where this is? Well, we can't support blah blah blah. I'm like, really? I know where my pizza is at all times. Like a pizza chain is doing this, and you're telling me that with all the money floating around here, I can't know where things are going? Give me a break.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%.
Anyway, so before we wrap up, there's 3 questions that I asked, always on a positive note. First one is, if you had one wish for something you could change in your company or the industry as a whole, what would it be?
Well, that's a tough one. I think I would I would want everyone to walk into every problem with a lot of the same perspective that you and I talked about today. I tend to approach every problem like this. I don't know the answer. Let me learn what is possible, and let's build something immediately to make an impact. We don't have to plan for 8 months down the road. Let's build something and see how it does. And I wish that I could change that perspective in every client that I speak to and every problem we face internally. Usually it's when people aren't doing that something drags on until someone comes in and refocuses on that. And they're like, well, here's the actual problem. And we can solve that in a day. I would change that as a general perspective, and it would make every problem solving session so much more fun.
Second question is, what's been the biggest challenge in the company where it is today?
It's 2-part answer. One is just growing people and keeping them aligned to the same vision, to that same iterative approach, that same show, don't tell, try it out, see how it works. The more people you add, the more difficult it becomes to keeping that alignment. And then the second part of that answer is, we've more than tripled in space throughout COVID, which means that the majority, or it's tripled in size, not space. The majorody of those people
you have people going into the office. Give me a break.
We are opening an Office actually, 1 Yonge Street. We're just about to open up in a hybrid model. So we've been doing that, trying to keep that alignment, that entrepreneurial, that spirit, that agile spirit, when the majority of us have never even had face-to-face time. So that has been an extra challenge, and just I know there's been inflection points at 10 people, at 30 people, at 60 people, now at like 120 people, of how do you keep that same spirit as you keep growing in size?
Well, that's, people are often said as the number one challenge when it comes to any of this. So no surprise. And the last piece is, what excites you about what it is you're working on, keeps getting you out of bed every morning to keep on fighting the good fight?
I think it really is. We go back to the origin story. There are so many things that I love improving any experience, But the ones I love improving the most are ones that are stressful to people, like taking a test. Anything that has to do with your finances, your health, your loved ones, those are people are just scared. They're scared of making a mistake. They're scared of interacting, that it's going to be, it's going to cost me money, or it's going to affect some negative effect on my health. So watching the knowledge and those experiences come to life in a repeatable way that reduces that stress from the people that are interacting with it, that gets me excited every single time. And I just love it. I would love for the world to be as easy as tracking my pizza, tracking your pizza. Maybe not yours. I have maybe some privacy in there. I shouldn't know where your pizza's at, but
why would you care? It's like you just get hungry and want to order yourself.
Yeah, true enough. But yeah, I think that if the world can be a place where it's just so easy to interact with any process wherever I am, that keeps me getting up every day excited to be a part of that change, to whatever degree that is.
Art, thank you so much for taking the time. Greatly appreciate this. Very curious to see where this ends up going, and the exact kind of transformation, frankly, that just about every major company needs to look at. Empowering the people in the trenches, as opposed to the generals in the ivory tower controlling it all. And frankly, it's one of those things where I think the first time we talked, I was like, yeah, we're gonna get along fine, because you understand it doesn't have to be the way it is.
Yeah, but it hurts us both at the same time.
It does. It does. It hurts us deeply. It wounds us. Art,
I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
My pleasure. So that was today's episode of Fintech Impact. Hope you enjoyed that, and hope you take the time to look in not only what Daylight's doing, but also just no code in general, and just how, even, I kid you not, if you're semi-proficient with a computer, it doesn't take you long to learn some of these tools. It is quite incredible what you can get done these days. As always, if you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, or wherever's your podcast. Until next time, take care.
This podcast was brought to you by Woodgate Financial, an award-winning financial planning firm catering to high net worth individuals and their families. To learn more, go to woodgate.com. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play, or find more episodes at jasonpereira.com.